$100 million. A bribery scheme buried in shadows. In a courtroom war so fierce, it split a nation in two. What really happened the night J.D. Vance stood tall on live TV and confronted Bernie Sanders, with nothing but the truth on his side and the weight of America's workers on his shoulders? Was it bravery, desperation, or the final stand of a man who refused to stay silent? As millions watched, holding their breath, a battle unfolded, not just for justice, but for the very soul of a nation. Now we take you inside that storm, the accusations, the secrets, the choices that change political history forever. And while this is a dramatized story inspired by political realities, every emotion, every moral question we explore speaks to the true struggles that define us as a people. While this story is a work of dramatization, but the fight for integrity is real. So what would you have done if $100 million of your country's future was at stake? Join us on this journey, because in the end, what's at stake isn't just $100 million, but what we stand for. It began on a night like any other, a night J.D. Vance would later replay in his mind over and over, searching for the exact moment the world he knew shifted beneath his feet. The clock in his study ticked toward midnight. Outside, the wind rustled through bare branches, tapping lightly at his window as if to warn him of what was coming. J.D. sat at his desk, alone, his mind heavy with the day's work, when a sound broke the stillness, the soft thud of something sliding through his mail slot. At first he ignored it. At that hour, what could possibly matter? But something, the timing, the silence that followed, or perhaps just instinct, compelled him to rise. He crossed the room, opened the door, and looked down. There on the floorboards lay an envelope. No stamp, no return address, no markings at all, except for his name, written in hurried block letters. J.D. hesitated. His fingers hovered over the envelope as a chill, unconnected to the drafty hallway, ran down his spine. This wasn't ordinary. He knew it. And yet his hand closed around the thick paper, as if by opening it, he could take control of whatever storm it carried. Back at his desk, the weight of the envelope felt disproportionate, heavier than paper should be. He broke the seal and a stack of neatly folded documents slid onto the wood grain. The first page bore a header he recognized instantly. Internal memo from the desk of a senior aide to Senator Bernie Sanders. The words beneath were worse than he could have imagined. Policy proposals in exchange for contributions. Foreign entities, nations J.D. knew had no interest in America's well-being, promising millions in support if trade regulations could be softened, if oversight could be weakened. J.D.'s eyes scanned faster, heart pounding in his ears. There were emails, terse and coded, but clear enough for anyone willing to see. Transaction records, wire transfers routed through shadow accounts, timed perfectly with key votes. He pushed the papers back, breath shallow, disbelieving. Could this be real? Could it be true that someone he'd shared a chamber with, someone who had stood and spoken of justice, of the American worker, was tied to this? J.D. stared at the documents, at the cold ink spelling out what he could hardly bring himself to read again. His mind reeled. He felt anger, betrayal, disbelief, but above all, the weight of a terrible choice. Could he trust these papers? And if he could, what then? He'd spent his career believing in institutions, in the slow grind of democracy, in the hope that beneath the noise, integrity endured. To act on this would mean tearing at the fabric of that belief. But to ignore it, what would that make him? The room felt smaller, the air thick. Every sound, the creak of his chair, the hum of the heater, seemed amplified in the tension that gripped him. J.D.'s gaze fell again on the envelope. Who had sent it? Why him? The anonymity gnawed at him, as dangerous as the contents it had carried. He thought of the workers he'd met, the men and women in steel mills, the farmers at town halls, the truck drivers who'd pulled him aside to ask if anyone in Washington still cared. He thought of their faces, of their trust. If what lay before him was true, then that trust had been sold. And if he stayed silent, he would be part of that betrayal. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes as if to demand a decision. J.D. folded the documents slowly, deliberately, and placed them back in the envelope. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, tired, uncertain, but resolved. Whatever this was, it couldn't be ignored. But even as he set the envelope down and reached for his phone, one question haunted him, more chilling than any accusation on the page. Who wanted him to know? And what would it cost to find out? The night bled into morning before J.D. Vance moved again. The envelope sat on his desk like a silent threat, its contents too heavy for sleep, too dangerous to ignore. His eyes, gritty from the hours of staring and thinking, drifted to the phone on the corner of his desk. He picked it up, thumb hovering over the contacts. There was only one name he trusted with something this volatile. Mark Halstead, a former federal investigator who had walked beside J.D. through hard fights before, a man known for peeling back layers of lies without fear or favor. Without allowing himself more time to second-guess, J.D. dialed. Mark's voice, gruff with sleep but sharp as ever, answered on the second ring. J.D. wasted no words. Within the hour, they sat together at J.D.'s kitchen table, papers spread between them, the early light casting long shadows that matched the weight of what lay before them. Mark read in silence, his brow furrowed deeper with every page. J.D. watched him, searching his face for signs of doubt, of dismissal, of any chance that this might all be some sick hoax. But when Mark finally spoke, his voice carried the certainty J.D. had both dreaded and needed. "This is no prank," Mark said, tapping a finger on one of the memos. "The language, the timestamps, the routing of these transactions, they're real. I've seen this kind of thing before. And whoever sent this didn't want to scare you. They wanted to arm you." The words sank into J.D. like lead. Arm him? For what? The storm these documents would unleash? The enemies he would make? He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, as the truth settled over him like a heavy cloak. There would be no unknowing now. The path ahead, dangerous and uncertain, had already begun the moment that envelope crossed his threshold. His mind echoed with a single thought, clear and cold. If I look away, I become part of the betrayal. Mark stayed a while longer, offering counsel, warning of the risks. But J.D. barely heard him. His thoughts had turned elsewhere, to the people behind the policies, the families whose lives balanced on the edge of these decisions made in marble chambers, far from their homes. As the sun rose higher, casting gold over the quiet streets outside, J.D. excused himself and stepped into the day, driven by a need to ground himself in what was real, what mattered beyond the swirl of politics and power plays. His feet took him where his heart had already gone, a modest home on the edge of town where the Carters lived. The father, Ben, was a steel worker J.D. had met at a rally, a man with rough hands and kind eyes who had spoken of layoffs and lost hope with a dignity that haunted J.D. still. Today, that house seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by the same invisible burden J.D. carried. He stayed at a distance, watching as Ben's wife helped their youngest tie worn shoes, as Ben loaded an old pickup with tools for side work that barely kept the lights on. Their faces bore the quiet strain of people fighting every day for scraps of security, for a future slipping further from reach. J.D. felt the weight of his choice sharpen into resolve. These were the people betrayed when deals were struck in back rooms, when votes were bought and sold like cheap goods. These were the lives he had sworn, in his heart if not his oath, to protect. No matter the cost to his career, his reputation, even his peace, J.D. knew there was no turning from this. His promise was silent but fierce. "I'll protect them." The thought anchored him as he turned back toward the storm that awaited, the storm he would no longer avoid. The weight of his silent promise to protect Ben Carter's family followed J.D. Vance home, like a shadow that refused to lift. Long after the city's lights dimmed and its streets emptied, J.D. found himself unable to rest. The envelope still lay on his desk, untouched since the morning, but it seemed to pulse with the same quiet urgency that now thrummed in his veins. He stepped outside, needing space, air, distance from the walls that felt too close, too heavy with the truth he could no longer ignore. The night was cold, but J.D. welcomed the bite of the air. It kept him alert as he walked the familiar streets of his neighborhood, streets that should have brought comfort, but now only echoed with the questions that refused to leave him be. With each slow step along cracked sidewalks and under flickering street lamps, JD turned those questions over in his mind like stones too rough to set down. What if exposing this set loose a storm that consumed not just those guilty, but innocent lives as well? What if the nation, weary of scandal and betrayal, turned its anger not on the corrupt, but on him? What if the forces behind this ran deeper than he could see, and in challenging them, he risked tearing at the fragile fabric that still held the country together? He could hear Mark's earlier warnings, low and grave. This will not end with applause, JD. It will end with scars. JD knew it. He had seen enough of politics to understand that truth rarely came without cost. But tonight, that cost felt more personal, more dangerous than any he'd faced before. He passed houses he'd seen 1,000 times, windows glowing softly with the lives inside. Families gathered at late dinners, a woman rocking a child back to sleep, a man at his kitchen table reading the paper by weak light. They lived their lives believing, at least in part, that those in power worked for them. What would it mean to shatter that faith, to force them to see how easily their futures could be bartered away? JD's steps slowed as he reached the edge of the small neighborhood park. The swings creaked in the wind, empty but moving, as if haunted by unseen players. He stood there, hands deep in his pockets, and stared out over the quiet spaces where children played, where neighbors gathered on summer nights, where hope still lingered in small, ordinary moments. It struck him then that the lives represented in those glowing windows, the laughter that filled these streets in better seasons, this was what was at stake. Not votes, not headlines, not the games of power that consumed Washington, but the simple promise of safety, fairness, and dignity. The hours passed unnoticed as JD wandered, lost in thought, until the horizon began to pale with the first fragile light of dawn. He found himself at the top of a small hill that overlooked the city, the buildings below touched with gold where the sun began to rise. The envelope's contents, the faces of Ben's family, Mark's words, all swirled together in his mind, until there was only clarity where confusion had been. He drew in a breath, the cold air filling his lungs, steadying him. His voice was low, meant only for himself, but firm. This is bigger than politics. The words settled the storm inside him. JD turned toward home, no longer burdened by uncertainty, but driven by purpose. The decision had been made. He would act, not because it was safe, or easy, or without cost, but because to do anything less would be to betray everything, and everyone that mattered. The morning after his long, restless walk found JD Vance seated alone at his kitchen table, the first cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. Outside, the city stirred to life, unaware that within the next few hours, a political storm would break over it. JD's mind, though clear now, felt the press of urgency. The decision had been made on that hill at dawn. Now it was time to act. The documents lay beside him, their weight no longer symbolic but real, as if the truth they contained demanded to be carried into the light. He picked up the phone and made the call that would change the course of the days ahead. He requested a press conference. No delay, no filter. If the storm was to come, it would begin on his terms. Within hours, the briefing room at the State House was filled to capacity, the air charged with anticipation, curiosity, and the sharp edge of controversy that reporters could sense even before a word was spoken. JD stood at the podium, his posture steady, his expression resolute but somber. He had faced cameras before, spoken to crowds, debated in chambers. But this felt different. The stakes were higher, the cost of misstep greater. Yet as he scanned the room, he thought of the faces behind the windows of his neighborhood, of Ben Carter and his family, of the workers and farmers and small business owners who deserved the truth, however hard it might be to hear. He began not with accusation, but with purpose. His voice, though measured, carried the weight of conviction. This isn't about politics. This isn't about party lines. This is about protecting our workers. This is about protecting our sovereignty. The room fell quiet, reporters leaning forward as the gravity of his words settled over them. JD drew a breath, steadying himself for what had to come next. He outlined carefully but without apology the disturbing evidence in his possession. Memos, emails, financial trails that suggested foreign money had flowed to buy favor. That policy had been shaped not by the interests of the American people, but by promises made in the shadows. And then, because the truth demanded nothing less, he spoke the names. The senior aides to Bernie Sanders, who, according to the documents, had brokered the deals, had sent the emails, had facilitated the transactions. JD did not accuse for spectacle. His words were chosen for clarity, for accountability. I am calling today for a full investigation, immediate, thorough, transparent. The American people deserve to know who is working for them and who is selling them out. The impact was instant. Reporters shouted questions even before he stepped away from the podium. Headlines were drafted before he left the building. By the time he returned to his office, his words had begun their spread. Across television screens, through social media feeds, on the front pages of news sites nationwide. Vance alleges foreign bribery scheme, one read. Senator calls out Bernie's team, declared another. The story was no longer his alone. It belonged to the nation now, to a public eager for truth, hungry for justice, or in some corners, ready to lash back at what they saw as betrayal or political warfare. From his window, JD watched the sun climb higher, watched as the world reacted in real time to the storm he had loosed. The weight he felt now was not of doubt, but of responsibility. The path forward would be hard, the opposition fierce. But as he turned back to the documents on his desk, as the first messages of support and of condemnation flooded his inbox, JD felt no regret. The fight had begun, and there was no turning back. The storm JD Vance had unleashed at that press conference spread with the speed and fury of wildfire. By nightfall, his words echoed across the nation, not only on the front pages of newspapers and the breaking banners of cable news, but in the urgent chatter of talk shows, the heated calls on radio lines, the passionate debates filling town halls from Ohio to the coast. Everywhere, it seemed, Americans were grappling with the accusation he had made and what it might mean. In diners and union halls, in offices and living rooms, in truck cabs and factory break rooms. His name was spoken with either respect or scorn, but never indifference. Some hailed him as a modern patriot, a man who had dared to shine light where too many chose the comfort of shadows. They called him brave, honest, a throwback to a time when leaders risked their careers to do what was right. Clips of his speech went viral. The quiet force in his voice, the way he named names without flourish or fury, as if the truth needed no decoration. Social media feeds lit up with messages of support, hashtags praising his courage, posts from ordinary citizens thanking him for standing up for workers who had too long been forgotten by the powerful. But not all voices were kind. On other channels and other corners of the web, JD's actions were branded as political theater at its most dangerous, a reckless gambit that risked tearing apart what fragile unity remained in the nation's fabric. Pundits speculated that he was positioning himself for higher office, or settling scores, or stoking division for personal gain. They accused him of fanning flames of distrust at a moment when the country could ill afford more strife. Editorials warned of the damage done by dragging unproven allegations into the public square, of undermining faith in government, of inviting chaos at the altar of ambition. JD watched this unfold with a mix of resolve and unease. From his office window, he could see the world outside unchanged, the same traffic, the same faces moving through the routines of daily life. But inside, the atmosphere crackled with tension. His team felt it too. Aides who had once met his gaze with easy confidence now glanced at him with worry. With the burden of those who understood, they stood in the eye of a storm far larger than any they had known. Whispers of threats began to surface, emails filled with venom, voicemails that trembled with rage. And then worse, his family's name dragged into the fray, his wife's social media accounts flooded with hatred, his children's school receiving anonymous calls that chilled JD more than any headline ever could. In those moments, JD felt the true cost of the stand he had taken. The abstract weight of duty became painfully real, measured in sleepless nights and the hard questions from those he loved most. "Is it worth it?" he heard in the quiet spaces between the noise. And though the answer did not come easy, it came honest. Yes, because to do less would be to accept the betrayal as fact, to teach his children that silence in the face of wrong was the safer choice, the wiser path. And so JD steadied himself, even as the nation roared around him, divided and uncertain. He knew the days ahead would test him in ways no speech, no vote, no campaign ever had. But the decision was made, the lines drawn. The storm had only just begun. The noise had barely begun to settle when J.D. Vance took the next inevitable step. For days he had weighed the options, counseled with his team, listened to legal minds who warned of the scale of the storm he was about to summon. But in the end, the decision came down to the same quiet promise he had made to himself on that cold dawn: to protect those whose voices too often went unheard, to stand where so many others chose not to. And so, with steady hand and a heart heavy but resolute, J.D. signed the legal papers that would thrust the battle into the courts. The lawsuit was filed, a demand for $100 million in damages, funds he insisted that belonged to the American industries harmed by the alleged bribery, to the workers left behind by decisions made in secret rooms for foreign gain. The figure itself, bold and uncompromising, captured headlines within minutes. J.D. Vance files $100 million suit over alleged foreign bribery, blared across networks and news feeds. Pundits debated the scale and audacity of the claim, some calling it a long overdue stand for economic justice, others dismissing it as a gamble too risky for a nation already weary of division. JDD did not watch the broadcasts. His mind was fixed on the purpose behind the numbers, the faces that filled his memory. The steel worker scraping together odd jobs to feed his family, the farmer counting every dollar of a shrinking harvest, the small manufacturers driven to close as markets were tilted against them. The lawsuit was not about spectacle. It was at its heart a bid for restitution, a demand that wrongs done in the dark be paid back in the light. But no action comes without cost, and no stand goes unchallenged. Even before the ink had dried, the first signs of retaliation stirred. Bernie's supporters, already roused by JD's accusations, mobilized in force. Rallies sprang up in cities and towns, crowds waving placards, their chants filling the air with defiance. "Hands off, Bernie!" they cried. "Smear campaign!" Red, hastily printed signs, hoisted high before the cameras that gathered to catch every angle of the unfolding clash. Social media platforms crackled with outrage and defense, each post sharper than the last, each comment a reflection of the widening chasm in the national conversation. JD watched from his office window as a small group gathered beyond the building's steps, their voices carrying through the crisp air. He felt no anger at them, only the familiar weight of knowing how easily truth could be drowned in the noise of partisanship, how quickly the fight for integrity could be twisted into a battle of factions. Inside, his team moved with quiet urgency, fielding calls, drafting statements, bracing for what they all knew would be a long and bruising fight. And yet, in the midst of the rising clamor, JD felt the steadiness of his cause. The papers were filed, the lines drawn. The courtroom would now become the stage where truth and power would collide, and where he hoped justice might finally be served. If filing the lawsuit had been the opening salvo, the response from Bernie Sanders' camp came as a calculated counterstrike, swift, sharp, and designed to wound not just JD's case, but his very character. Within hours of the lawsuit's announcement, Bernie's legal team took to the airwaves, their message crafted for maximum impact. On morning shows, evening panels, in press statements that spread like wildfire across digital feeds, they spoke with the authority of seasoned fighters well-versed in turning defense into attack. "This is baseless slander by a man desperate for attention," declared one of Bernie's top attorneys, his voice measured but laced with disdain. "Mr. Vance has chosen spectacle over substance, smearing a public servant with wild accusations to score cheap political points." The words echoed across the media landscape, repeated and reframed, dissected and debated. Clips of Bernie's defenders played on loop, serious faces framed by studio lights, voices steady as they painted JD as reckless, opportunistic, a man who had betrayed the dignity of his office for the fleeting thrill of headlines. Editorials appeared overnight, questioning his motives, warning of the danger of turning complex trade policy into a courtroom circus. Social media that had once buzzed with praise now simmered with skepticism. Maybe Vance overplayed his hand, one commentator suggested. What if this is just another stunt in an age full of them? The tide so recently at JD's back began to shift, subtle at first, then stronger as polls reflected the changing mood. His approval ratings dipped, his name, once associated with courage, now entangled with words like reckless, divisive, and worst of all, self-serving. JD felt the weight of it in every interaction. He saw it in the eyes of colleagues who now paused before offering their support, in the questions that grew sharper at press scrums, in the tone of messages filling his inbox, once full of gratitude, now laced with doubt or outright anger. He read the headlines, listened to the voices of those who questioned whether he had crossed a line from principled stand to dangerous grandstanding. And though he had prepared himself for backlash, the reality of it hit harder than he'd expected. Because this was not just a fight over policy or even justice. This was now a fight for his integrity, his name, the trust he had worked years to build among people who mattered far more to him than any party or platform. Yet even as the storm of criticism gathered force, JD held to the core truth that had driven him from the start. The documents were real. The threat to American workers was real. The need to act had been real and remained so, no matter how fierce the pushback or how deep the doubt sown by skilled opponents. He reminded himself of the Carters, of the factories and farms he had walked among, of the quiet faces who looked to their leaders not for theater, but for the hard work of defending what was right. And so, as the noise grew louder, JD braced himself, knowing that the battle ahead would test not only his case, but his very standing in the eyes of those he had sworn to serve. The storm of public opinion that battered JD Vance's reputation was only the first front in what quickly became a grinding, relentless prelude to the legal battle ahead. No sooner had Bernie Sanders' legal team denounced the lawsuit in the media than they moved to dismantle it within the courtroom. The filings came fast, precise, and with the clear intent of bearing JD's case before it could ever see the light of a full trial. Motions to dismiss flooded the docket, pages upon pages arguing that JD's claims were frivolous, that the evidence was circumstantial, that no court should entertain what they painted as a dangerous political stunt cloaked in the language of justice. Every motion was designed not just to block JD's path, but to exhaust him, to tie his team in procedural knots until they had no strength left to fight. JD's legal team, small but determined, met every filing with counter-arguments, every delay tactic with resolve. But it was like fighting in quicksand. The more they struggled to move forward, the deeper they seemed to sink. Leaks, too, began to surface. Details of their strategy, selective quotes from internal communications, dribbling out in ways designed to embarrass, to undermine, to feed the narrative that JD was out of his depth. The media, hungry for every scrap, reported on each twist, often with a tone of growing skepticism. Allies JD had once counted on fell silent, unwilling to be drawn into what now looked, to many, like a losing cause. The days blurred into nights as JD pored over documents, met with counsel, weighed new filings, and tried to anticipate the next ambush his opponents might spring. His face grew lined from lack of rest. His voice, once firm and sure, now carried a fatigue that no amount of resolve could fully mask. And yet, in the midst of the pressure, he refused to yield. The truth, he reminded himself again and again, had not changed. The duty he had embraced had not lessened, no matter how fierce the storm. It was during one of these long, heavy days that JD stepped away, not out of retreat, but out of necessity. He drove alone to the outskirts of a town he had visited often during campaigns, to a factory he remembered as a symbol of American craftsmanship and pride. Now it stood shuttered, its windows dark, the lot empty except for weeds breaking through cracked pavement. JD parked, got out, and stood in the quiet, the air thick with the memory of work once done, of livelihoods once secured. He walked slowly along the fence line, taking in the stillness, the absence of sound, where once machines had roared and workers had laughed and shouted across the floor. It was here, more than in any courtroom or chamber, that JD felt the purpose of his fight take root again. The cost of bad trade deals, of policies shaped by foreign interests and hidden money, was written plainly on this empty shell of industry. As he stood in that silence, the weight of exhaustion lifted, replaced by the steady burn of resolve. He turned back toward his car, the sun setting behind the factory's broken roofline, casting long shadows over ground that deserved better. JD knew then that whatever traps were set before him, whatever tactics were deployed to break his spirit, he would not abandon the path he had chosen. The pre-trial war would rage on, but so would he. The factory's silhouette faded behind him as J.D. Vance returned to the Capitol, the renewed fire in his chest tempered by the cold reality that awaited him. The pre-trial war raged on, but beyond the legal motions and media battles, J.D. began to feel the subtler, quieter front where the cost of his stand revealed itself most clearly. In the distance growing between him and those he had once counted as allies. In committee rooms and corridors, in private meetings and casual conversations, the change was unmistakable. Where there had been nods of greeting, there were now averted gazes. Where once there had been handshakes and quiet words of encouragement, now came polite silence, or worse, the hollow formalities that marked the space where trust had eroded. His closest allies in the Senate, men and women who had shared strategies with him, broken bread with him, stood beside him on other fights, now measured their steps, their words, their proximity. J.D. understood. The storm he had loosed threatened to sweep them up too, and few had the stomach to weather it alongside him. Meetings were canceled, invitations rescinded, conversations once warm grew guarded, as if merely standing too near might draw the lightning of controversy down upon them. J.D. bore it without bitterness. He had known when he chose this path that there would be no applause for truth, only silence. Or worse, the soft turning away of those too fearful or too weary to stand beside him. But knowing did not lessen the sting. It did not ease the isolation that grew heavier with each passing day. That night, unable to sleep, J.D. left his office and took to the streets of Washington, the city's monuments looming in the quiet dark. The familiar buildings, the grand marble facades, seemed colder now, their beauty stark against the emptiness of the hour. His footsteps echoed along near-empty sidewalks, the rhythm steady as he let his thoughts unwind in the hush of the night. He walked past the Capitol, its dome lit against the sky, a reminder of the ideals he had come to serve, and now seemed to be defending alone. He passed statues of long-dead leaders, men immortalized for choices that, in their day, had drawn scorn as often as praise. The irony was not lost on him. J.D. thought of the faces that had once surrounded him in support, of the quiet absence that had replaced them. He thought of his family bearing the weight of threats and scrutiny, of his team, stretched thin and weary but loyal still. He thought of the workers and families who would never know the battles fought in their name, and of the cost that truth demanded. He paused at the edge of the reflecting pool, watching the ripples spread across the water. The lights of the city fractured in their dance. The wind carried a bite, but he welcomed it. It kept him awake, reminded him that, for all the loneliness of this road, he was still here, still standing. No applause for truth, J.D. murmured to the night, the words carried off by the breeze. Only silence. And yet in that silence he found his answer. The path was lonelier than he had imagined, the cost steeper, but the fight remained the same. With one last look at the city he had sworn to serve, J.D. turned back toward the storm, resolved to see it through. The lonely road J.D. Vance had walked in the nights leading up to the trial gave way to the bright, unflinching light of the courtroom. The storm that had raged in the media, in backroom whispers, and in J.D.'s own conscience now focused itself here, in this chamber where the law would strip away noise and leave only fact, or so J.D. hoped. The opening of the trial felt both solemn and electric, as if the air itself recognized that what would unfold within these walls would shape not only the lives of those seated at council tables, but the faith of a nation watching with bated breath. J.D. sat surrounded by his legal team, their faces set with quiet resolve. The fatigue of the long pre-trial war still showed in their eyes, but beneath it glowed the fierce determination of those who knew what was at stake. When their time came, J.D.'s lead counsel rose, his voice steady, free of flourish or theatrics. Their strategy was simple: no grandstanding, no appeals to outrage, only clarity. They would present their case like steel, solid, unadorned, forged in fact. This case is not about headlines, the lawyer began, and it is not about party. This is about the future of American workers, about the integrity of our laws, about whether our nation's policies are written in the interest of its people or sold to the highest foreign bidder. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, the weight of the words settling on jurors, observers, and even the press gathered at the edges. J.D. watched as his team laid out the foundation of their argument. Documents entered into evidence that showed the flow of money, the timing of policy shifts, the communications that linked the two. There were no wild accusations, no leaps of logic. Each fact connected to the next, like links in a chain that pointed to a simple, damning conclusion. The interests of the American people had been betrayed, and that betrayal had been bought. When they finished, the air seemed to hum with the tension of a truth too uncomfortable to dismiss outright, yet too stark to ignore. J.D. felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps facts alone might carry the day. But that hope was short-lived. Bernie Sanders' team rose, their lead attorney a man practiced in the art of dismantling, with a smile. His tone was warm, even indulgent, as if humoring a child who had gotten carried away with a tall tale. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you've just heard is not a case. It's a fantasy, a carefully woven story built on coincidence and conjecture, designed to distract and divide." He spoke of J.D. as a man lost in his own ambition, so eager to be seen as a hero that he had mistaken shadows for enemies. He dismissed the documents as misinterpreted, the connections as imaginary, the entire case as a dangerous waste of the court's time. And as he spoke, J.D. saw heads nod in the gallery, saw jurors glance at one another, uncertainty creeping in where certainty had begun to take root. When the opening salvos were done, J.D. knew the battle ahead would be harder than even he had braced for. The facts were on his side, but facts alone, he now saw, would not be enough. The heart of a nation had to be reached, and that, he realized, was the truest fight of all. If the opening statements had drawn the battle lines, it was in the days that followed that the true weight of J.D. Vance's case began to take form. The courtroom, once merely the setting for arguments, became a crucible where facts were tested, where testimony was forged under the heat of cross-examination, and where the stakes became clearer with every word spoken. J.D. sat forward in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on each witness as they took the stand. Workers, analysts, experts who spoke not in abstractions, but in the hard truths of lives changed, futures lost, and industries hollowed out by policies shaped not for people, but for profit. One by one, they told their stories. A steel worker who had once overseen hundreds on the factory floor described the slow death of his plant. Each shift in regulation, timed with sudden, unexplained competitive advantages granted to foreign firms. A small-town mayor recounted the collapse of his community's economy after a trade deal passed with baffling loopholes that no one in his town had asked for, but which had gutted local businesses all the same. An economic analyst mapped the timeline on a screen. Policy changes here, financial contributions there, each point a nail driven into the argument that these were coincidences. The pattern was too precise, too aligned, too damning. J.D.'s legal team introduced the documentary evidence with quiet, deliberate force. Email chains that revealed discussions between senior aides and lobbyists representing foreign interests, their language careful but unmistakable in meaning. Banking records that traced donations through layers of shell organizations before they surfaced in political funds. Lobbyist statements that, under oath, acknowledged meetings where policy priorities were discussed in terms that left little doubt what was being purchased. With each new piece of evidence, the tension in the room rose, the hum of nervous energy growing stronger. Jurors leaned closer, reporters scribbled faster. Even Bernie's team, so confident in their scorn, began to exchange glances marked by the first signs of unease. Yet J.D. knew, even as the foundation of his case grew stronger, that the battle was far from won. Facts could be twisted, patterns could be dismissed as coincidence by those determined not to see. And so he watched not just the evidence, but the faces of those who heard it. The jurors, the judge, the observers packed into the gallery. He searched for signs that the weight of truth was reaching them, that the human cost buried in these documents and testimonies was becoming real to them, as it had long been real to him. When court adjourned for the day, JD stepped outside into the fading light, the air thick with the murmur of reporters, the click of cameras, the swirl of opinion that would spin the day's revelations into headlines and sound bites before the night was over. He felt the fatigue in his bones, the pressure of a fight that was wearing at him piece by piece. But beneath it all, he felt, too, the unshakable knowledge that they had done what was needed. They had laid bare the facts, unvarnished and unflinching. The truth was in the open now, and whatever came next, there was no putting it back in the dark. For a fleeting moment, it had felt as though the tide was turning, that facts, testimony, and irrefutable patterns might finally cut through the fog of doubt and distraction. J.D. Vance had watched jurors nod subtly as charts aligned, as documents spoke louder than words, as witnesses told truths too long buried. But just as the foundation seemed solid beneath his case, the blow came, swift, brutal, and harder than even he had braced for. It began with a whisper, quiet chatter between Bernie's legal team during a break, the kind of exchange that meant a new strategy had been set in motion. Then as court resumed, JD's star witness, a respected lobbyist turned whistleblower, the man whose testimony had drawn the clearest line between policy decisions and foreign cash, stepped back onto the stand. His face was pale, his eyes downcast, as if weighed down by an invisible force that none could see but all could sense. The questioning began, but the confident, steady voice that had once described meetings and memos with detail and conviction was gone. Instead came hesitation, then contradiction, and finally, in words that seemed to drain the air from the room, the witness retracted the heart of his earlier statement. "Upon further reflection," he said, voice thin, "I cannot in good conscience confirm that the meetings I described were intended to influence policy in exchange for donations. Any earlier suggestion otherwise was a misinterpretation on my part." A hush fell over the courtroom, the kind that follows the crack of thunder before the storm breaks in earnest. J.D. felt it hit, sharp and deep, not just the loss of a key piece of his case, but the unraveling of momentum, of credibility, of hope. His team sat stunned, eyes locked on the man who, days before, had seemed a beacon of integrity. Bernie's lawyers pounced, their questions turning the retraction into a weapon, their tone rich with vindication. The jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions now clouded with uncertainty. And outside the courtroom, as news spread, the media began to frame the story with brutal efficiency. Key witness reverses course. Vance case falters. Collapse of a crusade? Doubt cast on $100 million lawsuit. JD's mind raced even as he sat outwardly composed. He thought of the long hours, the risks taken, the promises made. Not to himself, but to the people he represented. The blow was real. The case was wounded. But the truth remained, whether or not a frightened man chose to recant on the stand. He could see it in the documents, in the timelines, in the hollowed-out factories and the lives left in their wake. He could feel it in the weight of every decision that had brought him here. And in that moment, as the courtroom atmosphere turned hostile, as cameras waited for him to falter, J.D. found his center once more. "We fight because it matters," he said quietly to his team as they gathered in a recessed corner, their confidence shaken. The words steadied not only them, but himself. "Not because it's easy, not because we're certain of victory, but because what's at stake is too important to walk away from." Outside, reporters prepared to write the next chapter of what they now called JD's failed crusade. Inside, JD stood ready for the next round, knowing that the hardest battles lay ahead and that the price of truth was often highest just before the breakthrough. The courtroom had emptied, but its shadows seemed to follow J.D. Vance as he returned to the quiet of his office. The day's blow lingered. He could feel it in the slump of his shoulders, in the heaviness that filled the air, in the quiet that was no longer a refuge but a reminder of how alone the fight had become. The lights of Washington glimmered beyond his window, a city that moved on, indifferent to the storm that churned inside one of its own. J.D. sat at his desk long after his team had gone. the silence broken only by the faint hum of the night and the soft rustle of papers as he opened letters piled high before him. They had come in waves, these letters. Emails, handwritten notes, social media messages forwarded to his office. Some offered words of support, of encouragement from those who still saw the purpose behind his struggle. But far more bore anger, frustration, even betrayal. Voters who had once cheered his courage now questioned his judgment. You're tearing this country apart. Why waste time on fantasies while real people suffer? I thought you were better than this. The words cut deep, not because they came from enemies, but because so many came from those JD had hoped to serve, from voices he had always tried to honor. He read them all, refusing to turn away from their pain, their disappointment. Each one weighed on him, adding to the burden he had chosen to carry. The fatigue of sleepless nights, of long days in court, of endless strategy sessions, and moments of self-doubt pressed in on him. And yet he remained at his desk, unwilling to let the darkness claim the final word. He pulled a battered journal from the drawer, its pages already filled with notes, thoughts, reflections from the journey that had brought him here. Tonight, the blank page seemed to wait for him, to offer a place for truths he could not speak aloud, not yet. The pen felt heavy in his hand, but he began to write, the words flowing as if they had waited too long to be freed. I do not know if this will end as I hoped, he wrote, his handwriting steady despite the tremor he felt inside. I do not know if the truth will break through the noise or if the storm will drown it out. But I know this. If I fail, at least I failed for the right reason. Not for ambition, not for glory, but because I could not look away, because I could not stay silent. The words on the page brought no comfort, but they brought clarity. JD set down the pen and closed the journal, the weight of the day settling around him like the night itself. Outside, the city's monuments stood silent, their stones etched with the names of those who had fought battles harder than his, who had faced darker hours and yet endured. He drew strength from that thought, from the knowledge that the road he walked, though lonely, was not new, not his alone. The darkest hour had come, but the dawn would follow. JD leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and prepared himself for what the next day would bring. The fight was not over. It had only entered its hardest, most honest phase. The night had surrendered to morning by the time JD Vance stirred from his restless thoughts. The quiet resolve that had filled his journal hours before still anchored him, but the weight of defeat lingered at the edges of his mind. The courtroom blow, the letters of disillusioned voters, the growing sense of isolation, each had carved at his spirit. Yet as dawn broke over the city, JD forced himself from his chair, determined to meet whatever came next with the same honesty that had brought him this far. He was gathering his papers when the knock came, a soft, deliberate rapping at the office door that felt strangely out of place in the early hush. JD opened it to find a figure from the past. Judge Franklin Shaw, retired but far from forgotten, a man whose reputation for integrity had made him a quiet legend in legal circles. The years had silvered his hair and softened his frame, but his eyes remained sharp, and the set of his jaw spoke of purpose. Without waiting for an invitation, the judge stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a finality that sent a flicker of curiosity through JD's fatigue. I've been following your case, Shaw said simply, his voice low but firm, and I think you've missed something. Not by fault, son, but because the fight's been coming at you from every side. He placed a worn leather folder on the desk, the corners creased with age, the papers within marked by time and use. JD watched as the judge opened it, revealing records that at first glance seemed mundane. Supplemental filings, financial disclosures, appendices to reports no one had paid much mind. But as Shaw spoke, tracing connections with an experienced finger, the pieces began to shift in JD's mind, forming a new, clearer picture. There's a trail here, Shaw explained, hidden beneath the noise. Donations routed through layers so thin no one bothered to look closer. But the dates match, the entities match, and if you follow it to the end, it ties back to your case, cleaner than anything they've been able to discredit so far. His voice dropped lower, a hint of urgency beneath the calm. You can revive this, JD, But you have to act fast before they bury it deeper or twist it into something it's not. For the first time in days, JD felt a spark within him, a flicker of hope that cut through the haze of weariness. He studied the pages, the details he and his team had overlooked in the blizzard of motions and attacks. The lifeline was real, fragile perhaps, but real. He straightened, the exhaustion still there, but no longer hollowing him out. There was work to do, a path forward where minutes before there had been only dead ends. By midday, JD had gathered his team, their faces drawn but attentive as he laid out the findings. The room filled with the low murmur of renewed energy, of questions asked and plans formed. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it no longer felt lost. JD allowed himself a breath, steady and full, as they prepared to take their next steps. The storm still raged, but so did they. The hours that followed Judge Shaw's visit passed in a blur of focused intensity. JD Vance and his team, fueled by the fragile but vital thread the retired judge had placed in their hands, worked with a precision born of desperation and renewed purpose. Documents once dismissed as noise were re-examined under sharper eyes. Patterns hidden in the static of endless filings were teased into the light. In the quiet hum of their office, laptops flickered with data, charts grew on whiteboards, and a map of transactions and entities began to emerge. Lines once faint now, bold with meaning. It was one of JD's younger legal analysts, bleary-eyed from hours of cross-referencing dates and transfers, who finally drew the connection that changed everything. Buried within encrypted records, files disclosed under subpoena but overlooked in the flood of paperwork, was the link they needed. Shell companies with bland, forgettable names, registered in distant jurisdictions, had funneled large sums to PACs tied directly to Bernie's political machinery. The donations, layered through complex routes meant to disguise their origin, ultimately traced back to foreign sources, entities with vested interests in trade deals and regulatory shifts that had crippled American industries. JD stood over the analyst's shoulder as the final piece clicked into place. The web of deception laid bare on the screen before them. His heart pounded not with triumph, but with the sober weight of what they now held. This wasn't theory or interpretation. This was fact, clean and clear. The connection that had always existed beneath the noise was now undeniable. And with it came the responsibility to act, to bring what they had found out of the quiet of their war room and into the full glare of the courtroom, of the nation. The room seemed to still as JD turned to face his team, the weight of their long, bitter fight reflected in every weary face. He felt their exhaustion, their hope, their fear, but above all, their readiness. The path would still be hard. The forces aligned against them would not yield easily. But now they had what they needed. The breakthrough wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was the key to restoring the heart of their case, to rebuilding what the courtroom blow had threatened to destroy. Now, JD said quietly, but with a strength that filled the room, we bring the truth to light. The simple words carried the resolve that had driven him from the beginning, through the long nights, the doubts, the isolation. It was no longer about him or even his team. It was about the promise he had made in his heart, to the workers he had met, to the families left in the wreckage of bad deals, to the idea that the truth, once uncovered, must be spoken no matter the cost. As the team began preparing the next day's filings, refining arguments, assembling exhibits that would make the complex trail clear to jurors and the public alike, JD allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Outside, the city pulsed as it always did, indifferent to the battles fought within its walls. But inside that small office, something had shifted. The breakthrough had come, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose that no smear campaign or courtroom ambush could erase. The storm would continue, but at last they had the wind at their backs. The courtroom, once a theater of arguments and counter-arguments, now held the stillness of a stage set for reckoning. JD Vance rose from his seat, the quiet rustle of his suit the only sound as he stepped toward the witness stand where Bernie Sanders waited. The moment had been a long time coming, shaped by sleepless nights, by the weight of lost support, by the fire of rediscovered purpose. JD felt that weight as he met Bernie's gaze, but he also felt the clarity that came from knowing the facts were on his side at last. The judge nodded, granting JD the floor. He clasped his hands behind his back, grounding himself in the moment, and began, not with fury, not with flourish, but with the calm authority of a man who knew the truth and would see it spoken aloud. His voice, steady but firm, carried through the room. "Senator Sanders, I appreciate you taking the stand today," JD began, the courtesy deliberate, the trap already set. "I'll keep my questions focused and clear. The American people deserve that much." He paused, letting the room settle, letting the gravity of the exchange take hold. Then, with a voice that cut through the air like steel, he asked the question that had burned in him since the first night the documents crossed his desk. "Senator Sanders, who do you serve, America or profit?" A hush fell so deep it seemed even the courtroom walls strained to hear the answer. Bernie shifted in his seat, his practiced composure faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth, but no words came at first. JD watched unblinking as the older man searched for footing, for a way to parry a question that had no easy deflection. When Bernie did speak, his voice lacked its usual fire. "I serve the people," he said, but the words rang thin in the charged air. JD pressed forward, each step measured, each fact laid with precision. He drew from the records his team had uncovered, the shell companies, the donations masked by layers of secrecy, the policy shifts that followed like a shadow. He mapped the timeline for the court, his words crisp, his logic unassailable. "Senator, were you aware that these entities, which donated millions to committees supporting your work, were linked to foreign interests?" Bernie hesitated. JD allowed no room for retreat. "Were you aware, sir, that those same interests benefited from policy changes your office advanced within weeks of receiving those funds?" Bernie's lawyers objected, but the judge, seeing the clean line JD was drawing, overruled. The questions kept coming, each one anchored in fact, each one closing the space for evasion. Bernie tried to rally, tried to frame his answers in abstractions about global trade, about complexity, about the nature of modern politics. But JD stayed the course, bringing him back again and again to the simple, devastating through line: money, policy, betrayal. The jurors leaned in, the gallery silent but for the scratch of pens and the low hum of cameras capturing history in the making. JD could feel the tide shift, not as a wave of triumph, but as a quiet recognition that truth, once revealed, commands its own power. When he finally stepped back, the room seemed to exhale as one, the question he had posed at the start lingering in the air, like a challenge not just to Bernie Sanders, but to all who heard it. JD returned to his seat, the battle far from over, but the heart of the fight now laid bare for all to see. The courtroom emptied slowly after JD Vance's cross-examination, the weight of his words and the evidence he had laid bare hanging over all who had witnessed it. The jury was excused, filing out one by one, their faces set with the gravity of what lay before them. Now came the hardest weight of all. Outside the courthouse, the nation held its breath, divided in loyalty, but united in attention. News networks filled their screens with round-the-clock coverage. Radio stations hummed with analysis, speculation, and heated debate. Town halls, cafes, and living rooms became arenas of their own, where Americans argued, hoped, feared, and wondered what verdict would emerge from behind closed doors. JD felt the tension in the air, a tension so sharp it seemed to hum beneath the surface of the city. But inside, where the noise of pundits and public opinion could not reach, he knew he needed space to think, to breathe, to remember why this fight had begun. He left the courthouse by a side exit, avoiding the throng of cameras and questions waiting at the front. His feet carried him almost by instinct to a place that had long anchored his resolve. The steel memorial at the edge of the city, a tribute to the generations of workers whose labor had forged the nation's strength. The memorial stood quiet beneath the gray afternoon sky. Massive beams and riveted plates, salvaged from long-closed mills, assembled into a monument both stark and beautiful. JD approached it slowly, the weight of the trial and its uncertain outcome pressing on him with every step. He ran his hand along the cold steel, feeling the roughness beneath his fingers, the stubborn endurance of the material. Here, no words were needed. The memorial spoke for itself, of sweat and skill, of pride and sacrifice, of lives built around work that was honest, hard, and essential. He let the silence of the place steady him, let the memories of those he fought for rise to the surface. He thought of Ben Carter, of the men and women he'd met in shuttered factories and struggling towns, of the faces that had haunted and driven him since the first moment that unmarked envelope arrived. "We stand for those who built this nation," JD said softly. The words meant more for himself than anyone else. And in that moment, he felt again the clarity that had first set him on this path. That whatever the verdict, whatever the cost, the fight had been right. The truth deserved to be spoken. The betrayal deserved to be exposed. And those who had sacrificed so much for so long deserved at least that someone had tried. As he stood there, the city carried on around him. Cars passing, people moving through their lives. The great wheel of history turning as it always did. But JD felt, too, the weight of eyes upon the courthouse, of ears tuned to the verdict that had yet to come. In rooms across the country, people waited, some with hope that justice would prevail, others with dread, certain that the storm JD had stirred had done more harm than good, and many more with uncertainty, their faith in the system hanging in fragile balance. JD turned back toward the courthouse as dusk began to fall, the first lights flickering on across the city. He knew the decision would come soon, and whatever it brought, he would meet it with the same resolve that had carried him through every trial, every doubt, every lonely step along the way. The jury's deliberation would end. The nation would hear its answer, and J.D. Vance would be ready. The summons came as twilight deepened over the city. The jury had reached its decision. J.D. Vance returned to the courtroom, heart steady but heavy, knowing that whatever verdict awaited, the fight had already reshaped him, and perhaps in some small way, the country. The room filled once more, the tension sharp enough to be felt in the very air. Jurors filed in, their expressions solemn, bearing the weight of judgment. The foreperson rose, voice clear, the words carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "We, the jury, find that the defendant's campaign is liable. We order damages in the amount of $100 million to be paid into an American Industry Relief Fund for the purpose of rebuilding the communities harmed." The declaration seemed to hang for a moment, suspended between disbelief and the flood of reaction that followed. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. Then the dam broke. Cheers erupted from the gallery, mingled with tears from those who had feared justice would slip once again through their fingers. Outside, as word spread, city streets and small towns alike filled with voices raised in relief, in vindication, in cautious hope that perhaps the system still could answer to truth. The media captured it all, workers embracing outside shuttered plants, families watching screens with tears streaming down faces lined by years of struggle. Headlines blared, "Vance victory for American workers." 100 million verdict signals, new era of accountability. JD remained still, letting the sound wash over him, not as a man basking in triumph, but as one reflecting on all that it had taken to reach this moment. The scars of the battle would not fade easily, the friendships strained, the nights spent in doubt, the cost borne by his family, his team, himself. And yet, as he met the eyes of those who had stood beside him, as he felt the gratitude in the grip of a steelworker's handshake later that night, he knew the fight had been worth it. Justice at last had been rendered, and with it came not an ending, but a new beginning. For JD, for the people he had served, for a nation reminded of its strength. The verdict had come and gone, but JD Vance knew that justice delivered in a courtroom was only the first step in a longer, harder road. In the weeks that followed, he worked quietly, deliberately, to ensure the judgment wasn't just a symbol, but a catalyst for rebuilding. He stood at a modest podium, not in front of cameras or a roaring crowd, but before a gathering of workers, community leaders, and small business owners. His voice, steady and clear, announced what he saw as the true victory of the battle they had fought together. "Today we begin the work that matters most. I'm honored to announce the creation of the American Sovereignty Fund. This fund will direct every cent of that $100 million verdict toward reviving the industries that bad deals, bad actors, and betrayal left behind. It won't be quick. It won't be easy, but it will be ours, because this nation's strength has always come from its people, not its politics. Applause rose, not the thunder of spectacle, but the heartfelt sound of people who had waited too long for someone to put them first. JD met their eyes one by one, not as a hero, but as a servant determined to honor the trust they had given him. He refused interviews from networks eager to turn his story into headlines. He declined book deals, memoir offers, television specials. The fight, he reminded those who asked, had never been about his name. It had been about theirs, the names on factory walls, on union cards, on the rolls of businesses struggling to survive. JD chose the harder work: meetings with town leaders, plans drafted in long nights, visits to communities ready to rise again. And as the fund began its work, first grants awarded to reopen a small manufacturing plant, a loan to revive a steel mill, seed money for a trade school, JD found peace not in public praise, but in knowing that the verdict was not the end of their story. It was the start of something they would build together, stronger and fairer than what had come before. Months later, JD found himself standing before a small town hall, the kind of place where politics had always been personal, where neighbors gathered not for spectacle, but for truth. The room was simple: folding chairs, a scuffed wooden floor, the faint scent of coffee and old books. No stage, no bright lights, no teleprompters. Just JD, a handful of notes he would never look at, and a room full of faces who had lived the struggle and now shared in the work of renewal. He spoke not as a senator, not as a man who had led a legal battle that made national headlines, but as one neighbor speaking to others. His words came steady, plain, from the heart. Justice isn't given, it's made. It's made by ordinary people who stand up, who refuse to look away, who take the hits and keep going. What we did together wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it mattered. And it matters still, because every factory that reopens, every apprentice who finds their start, every town that sees its future again, that's justice too. The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. No cameras captured the moment, no social media clips went viral, but for those gathered there, it was enough. Many wiped their eyes, not with the wild fervor of rallies, but with the quiet relief of knowing that someone had fought and would keep fighting for them. When JD finished, he stepped down from the front. No fanfare, no applause demanded. Just nods, handshakes, and the soft murmur of thanks from those who had walked the hard road beside him. That night, JD walked alone through the streets of Washington, the city that had tested him, scarred him, and in its own way strengthened him. The air was cool, the dawn just beginning to break at the horizon, casting pale gold across the marble and stone of the Capitol dome. The city was quiet at this hour, its noise stilled, its power at rest. JD's steps echoed on the empty sidewalks as he passed the monuments, the offices, the buildings where history was written in votes, in laws, in the silent struggles that few would ever see. He paused at the steps of the Capitol, looking up at its familiar lines, the flag stirring gently in the morning breeze. His hand rose, almost without thought, to the steelworker's pin that still adorned his lapel. A simple piece of metal, worn now at the edges, but no less meaningful than the day he had first placed it there. It caught the early light, glinting like a promise kept, a reminder of who he served, of why he had chosen the harder road. The questions that had haunted him at the start, the doubts, the fears, the what-ifs, no longer weighed him down. The fight had changed him, as all worthy battles do. It had cost him more than he could have imagined, but it had also given him clarity, that the truth matters, not because it is easy, but because it is right. That justice is not the work of heroes, but of people who choose each day to stand when it would be easier to sit, to speak when it would be safer to stay silent. He stood there a while, watching as the dawn spread across the city, touching the monuments, the rooftops, the streets where history and hope met and mingled. And as he turned to walk on, JD's final thought was quiet but firm, a truth he carried now not as a burden, but as a banner. We choose truth, and that's enough. This story reminds us that truth often demands sacrifice, and that real justice is built not on applause, but on the quiet courage to stand for what's right, even when the road is lonely. JD's fight wasn't about personal glory, but about protecting ordinary people who too often go unheard. It challenges us to reflect. In a world of noise and distraction, will we choose the harder path to defend what matters? What would you have done if you stood in JD's shoes? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.